In an age of steel and shadow, a princess was nothing more than a kingdom's most valuable bargaining chip. Princess Emma of Euldoria, celebrated for her grace, was sold for peace, a sacrificial lamb sent to the altar of a brutal political alliance. Her groom, Duke Cailan of Valerian, a man known not by his name, but by his title, the Iron Duke. His duchy was forged in conquest, his reputation carved from the bones of his enemies. She arrived expecting a monster, a life of cold duty and silent fear. What she found was a labyrinth of secrets, a court of whispers, and a husband whose chilling indifference might just be the most terrifying mask of all. The scent of wilting roses clung to the air in the royal gardens of Euldoria, a scent Princess Emma felt had seeped into her very soul. It was the smell of beautiful things dying, a sentiment that mirrored her own fate. For 3 weeks since the treaty was signed, she had been a ghost in her own home, her future no longer a tapestry of her own weaving, but a stark, brutal contract written in the ink of political necessity. Her father, King Theron, a good man worn down by the burdens of a small resource. Poor kingdom had not been able to meet her eyes since. Euldoria was crumbling, caught between the ambitions of larger, predatory nations. Their only salvation, their only guarantee against being swallowed whole, was an alliance with the formidable Duchy of Valerian to the north, and the price of that alliance was her. She was to marry Duke Cailan, the so-called Iron Duke. The name was a whisper of fear across the continent. He had inherited a fractured duchy, and within 5 years had hammered it into a military and economic powerhouse. Stories of his methods were the stuff of nightmares. He had allegedly executed his own uncle for treason with his bare hands. He had razed the rebellious city of Oakhaven to the ground, salting the earth so nothing would grow there for a generation. He was a man of ice and iron, a ruthless pragmatist who saw people as assets or obstacles. Emma, she knew, was simply the most valuable asset Euldoria had left to offer. Her lady-in-waiting, a nervous girl named Isolde, wrung her hands as she packed the final trunk. They say the stone of his castle, Citadel Vorlag, weeps with the cold, even in summer, Your Highness. Emma placed a delicate leather-bound book of poetry into the trunk, her one small comfort. Then we shall have to wear warmer cloaks, Isolde. Her voice was steady, a carefully constructed dam against the flood of her terror. She had been raised for this, for duty. A princess was her kingdom's servant, first a woman, second. She would not weep. She would not show fear. She would be the perfect, placid duchess, and in doing so, she would save her people. The journey north was a funeral procession for her old life. The lush greens and gentle hills of Euldoria gave way to rugged, wind-swept plains and the jagged teeth of the Dragon's Tooth mountains that bordered Valerian. The air grew colder, sharper. The people they passed were different, too. Hardy, reserved folk with watchful eyes, their faces etched by harsh winds and harsher lives. They did not cheer for their new duchess. They merely observed her carriage with a stoic, unreadable curiosity. Citadel Vorlag was not a castle. It was a scar on the landscape. Hewn from the dark grey stone of the mountain, it was built. Against it rose in a series of brutalist towers and crenellated walls that seemed to challenge the very sky. There were no graceful spires, no welcoming gardens. It was a fortress, pure and simple, built to withstand a siege and project power. Weeping with cold, Isolde had said. It looked as if it had never known warmth at all. Duke Cailan was waiting for her in the great hall. The chamber was vast and intimidating, hung with banners depicting the snarling wolf of House Valerian. A massive fireplace roared at one end, but its heat seemed to be devoured by the sheer scale of the stone hall. And then she saw him. The stories had not done him justice. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that strained the dark, unadorned fabric of his tunic. His hair was the color of midnight, long enough to be tied back at the nape of his neck. But it was his face that held her captive. It was a composition of sharp angles and hard lines, a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same stone as his citadel. His eyes, a startling pale grey, like a winter sky, were fixed on her as she approached. There was no warmth in them, no welcome, only assessment. She sank into the practiced, perfect curtsy her tutors had drilled into her for 1,000 hours. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a quiet note in the cavernous hall. He did not move to help her up. He simply watched her, his expression an unreadable mask of granite. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Finally he spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "Princess Emma, you have arrived?" It was not a greeting. It was a statement of fact, as if he were acknowledging the arrival of a shipment of grain. He gestured dismissively to a stern-faced man at his side, whose armor was as polished as a black mirror. "This is Captain Garrick, the commander of my household guard. He will show you to your chambers. You will be expected for the evening meal at the 8th bell." And with that, he turned and strode from the hall, his heavy boots echoing on the flagstones, leaving Emma on her knees in the cold, oppressive silence. She had not expected warmth, but the sheer, chilling indifference was a blow more profound than any open hostility. She was not a bride. She was not even a person. She was a clause in a treaty, a piece of property delivered and signed for. As she rose, her legs trembling slightly, she caught the eye of Captain Garrick. His expression was as hard as his master's, but for a fleeting instant, she thought she saw something else in his gaze. Not pity, but something akin to it. A silent acknowledgement of the wolf's den she had just entered. Emma's chambers were as contradictory as the Duke himself. They were undeniably luxurious, with a canopied bed large enough for 6 heavy tapestries depicting ancient bloody battles, and a fireplace that was kept roaring by silent, efficient servants. Yet the opulence felt cold, impersonal. It was the gilded cage she had always feared. The windows, tall and narrow like an archer's slits, looked out not onto a garden, but onto a stark stone training yard, where the clang of steel on steel was a constant, unnerving chorus from dawn until dusk. Her first week in Citadel Vorlag was a study in isolation. Duke Kalen was an absence, a ghost in his own home. She saw him only at the evening meal, which was a tense, silent affair at a long table in the great hall. He sat at the head, she at his right hand, a chasm of polished oak between them. He never addressed her directly, speaking only to his captains and advisers about matters of state crop yields, iron production, border skirmishes. He ate with a focused, methodical efficiency, as if fueling a machine. Emma, in turn, learned to eat without tasting, to exist without being seen. The court of Valerian was a reflection of its master. The ladies were polite, but distant, their conversations shallow and guarded. The men were soldiers and strategists, their faces hard, their words clipped. There was no music, no laughter, no art. The citadel was a place of function, not feeling. Emma felt Isolde's fear like a constant shadow at her side, and she did her best to project a calm she did not feel. Yet amid the chilling austerity, strange inconsistencies began to appear, small cracks in the Duke's iron facade that Emma, with her keen, observant nature, could not ignore. On the 3rd day, she found a small, exquisitely carved bookshelf had been installed near her fireplace. It was filled with books, not histories of Valeria or tomes on military strategy, but poetry from Eldoria. The very collection she had been forced to leave behind, including the rare volume by the poet Amélie Vancourt that had been her mother's favourite. She asked a servant who had sent them, and the girl just bowed her head and murmured, "The Duke's orders, Your Grace." A few days later, while trying to choke down the robust, bitter tea that was common in the north, she made a passing comment to Isolde about how she missed the delicate silverwood tea from her homeland. The very next morning, a steaming pot of perfect silverwood tea was on her breakfast tray. The supply, she learned, was now limitless. The most unnerving incident happened at the end of the first week. Emma, desperate for a sliver of home, had discovered a small, neglected glasshouse on the far side of the citadel. It was derelict, the glass clouded with grime, the interior filled with frozen dead plants. She decided to make it her project, a way to cultivate a small piece of beauty in this barren place. She requested tools and seeds from the head groundskeeper, a gruff elderly man named Alistair. He had looked at her with suspicion, grumbling that the Duke had no time for such frivolities. The next day, Alistair appeared at her door, his face a mask of grudging respect. He presented her with a set of fine, new gardening tools and crates of rich soil. "The Duke's orders, Your Grace," he said, his tone one of bewilderment. "He said to give you whatever you required, and he specified that you were to be given the seeds for the Eldorian moon-petal rose. He said they were your mother's favourite." Emma was stunned into silence. How could this cold, brutal man know that it was a detail so personal, so intimate, she had scarcely spoken of it to anyone? The moon-petal rose, a pale, silvery white flower that bloomed only at night, was the symbol of her mother's garden. These small, inexplicable acts of consideration were more unsettling than outright cruelty would have been. Cruelty she understood. This was a language she could not decipher. Was he mocking her? Was it some kind of calculated strategy to make her compliant? Or was it something else, entirely? She began to watch him more closely during their silent dinners. She saw the way his hand resting on the table would clench almost imperceptibly when a captain reported a higher-than-expected casualty number from a border skirmish. She noticed that while his eyes were always assessing, they never once lingered on her with anything resembling lust or possession. It was a different kind of intensity, a deep, penetrating watchfulness she couldn't name. One evening, a visiting baron, a boorish man named Lord Fenn, had too much wine and made a thinly veiled lewd remark about the warmth of Eldoria's greatest export. The table fell silent. Emma froze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Before she could even think of a response, Caelan moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Lord Fenn. He simply picked up his own heavy silver goblet and slowly, deliberately crushed it in his fist. The sound of groaning metal was sickeningly loud in the silence. Wine and blood dripped from his knuckles onto the table. He placed the mangled goblet down with a soft thud. "The wine in Valerian appears to be stronger than you are accustomed to, my lord." Caelan said, his voice a deadly calm. "Perhaps you should retire before you further embarrass yourself." Lord Fenn, his face the colour of ash, practically fled the hall. Caelan then calmly wrapped his bleeding hand in a napkin, his grey eyes sweeping the table once. It was a silent, lethal warning to all. He never looked at Emma, but the message was unmistakable. She was his. And what was his, no one else was permitted to touch or tarnish. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't kind. But it was in its own brutal way a form of protection. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emma stood at her window watching the snow begin to fall over the training yard. The man was a fortress, just like his citadel, implacable cold and seemingly impenetrable. But she was beginning to suspect there was someone inside a prisoner behind the iron gates of his own making. And the mystery of who that man was, and why he knew the secrets of her heart, was becoming the most dangerous and compelling puzzle of her life. The arrival of Lord Morwen was like a sudden cloying perfume in the sterile air of Citadel Vorlag. He was the king's cousin, a diplomat, and a man whose power lay not in armies, but in secrets. Where Kaelin was all hard lines and grim silence, Morwen was smooth curves and silken words. He arrived with a retinue of brightly dressed courtiers, bringing a splash of unwelcome colour and an undercurrent of sophisticated menace to the Duke's court. "Duchess Emma," he said, bowing low over her hand, his smile not quite reaching his shrewd, intelligent eyes. "A flower of the south blooming in our harsh northern clime. We are all captivated." Emma offered a polite, practiced smile. "Lord Morwen, your reputation for charm precedes you, and your husband's reputation for efficiency precedes him." Morwen replied, his tone light but his gaze sharp, probing for a reaction. "It must be a significant adjustment for you." Morwen was the serpent in her cold stone garden. He sought her out, engaging her in conversations that were laced with carefully chosen questions and subtle insinuations about the Duke. He spoke of Kaelin's necessary ruthlessness with a feigned admiration that was really a form of condemnation. "The Duke is a remarkable man," he'd say, as they walked the castle battlements, the wind whipping at their cloaks. To take this duchy from his own blood, from his uncle Lord Valerius, it required a will of iron. Of course, some called Valerius a decadent fool, but family, is it not? Emma knew the official story. The previous Duke Kaelin's uncle had been a corrupt and weak ruler, bleeding the duchy dry to fund his lavish lifestyle, while his people starved and raiders harried the borders. Kaelin had led a rebellion, deposing him in a swift, brutal coup. But Morwen painted a different picture, one of a ruthlessly ambitious nephew, murdering a flawed but legitimate ruler. These whispers began to unnerve her. Kaelin never spoke of his past. He never spoke of anything personal at all. The man she shared a table with every night was a complete enigma, and into that void of knowledge Lord Morwen's poison began to seep. Meanwhile, her own life in the citadel was slowly changing. Her work in the glass house became her sanctuary. With the resources Kaelin had provided, she and a small team of groundskeepers, now led by a grudgingly loyal Alistair, were transforming the derelict space. They repaired the glass, tilled the soil, and planted the seeds of home. The Eldorian moon petals began to sprout fragile green shoots, pushing through the dark earth. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. Servants who had once been terrified shadows would now offer her small, shy smiles. Soldiers in the training yard would sometimes pause and nod respectfully as she passed. She was no longer just the foreign princess. She was the Duchess who was bringing life back to a dead corner of their grim fortress. One afternoon, while searching for a spare trowel in a dusty storage shed near the glass house, she stumbled upon a small, forgotten wooden chest. It was unlocked. Inside, beneath a pile of mouldering canvas, was a collection of charcoal sketches on brittle paper. They were amateurish but full of life and feeling. There were sketches of landscapes, of horses, of soldiers' faces. And then she found one that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a sketch of a young girl no older than 12, with long hair braided with ribbons. She was standing in a sun-drenched garden, laughing as she offered a piece of an apple to a small, scruffy dog. The detail was uncanny. The pattern on the girl's dress, the specific way a lock of hair curled by her ear. It was her. It was a perfect depiction of her from a midsummer festival in Eldoria, nearly a decade ago. She remembered that day, that dress, even the stray dog she'd befriended. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Who could have drawn this? Who, from this harsh northern land, could have been at her father's court all those years ago? Her mind immediately went to Caelan. Could this brutal warrior, this Iron Duke, be the one who had sketched a laughing girl from a rival kingdom? It seemed impossible. The image of his blooded, crushed goblet warred with the gentle, observant lines of the charcoal drawing. That evening at dinner, she watched him with new eyes, searching for any sign of the artist, the boy who had captured a moment of her childhood. She saw nothing but the cold, impassive Duke. Yet when Lord Morwen made another one of his slick, complimentary remarks to her, she saw Caelan's jaw tighten for a fraction of a second. His gaze flickered towards Morwen, and the cold indifference was replaced by a flash of pure glacial hatred. It was so swift she might have imagined it. But she knew she hadn't. The Duke hated Lord Morwen, and Lord Morwen was trying to poison her against the Duke. She was not a pawn in a game between kingdoms anymore. She was on the board of a much more personal and far more dangerous game being played within the walls of Citadel Vorlag itself. A few nights later, a terrible storm broke over the mountains, rattling the windows of the citadel. Isolde was jumpy, but Emma felt a strange sense of calm. She decided to visit her glass house to ensure the new panes were holding against the wind. Taking a lantern, she bundled herself in a heavy cloak and slipped out into the storm. As she neared the glass house, she saw another light flickering inside. Her heart leaped into her throat. Cautiously, she peered through the rain-streaked glass. It was Caelan. He was standing alone in the center of her glass house, the lantern light casting long dancing shadows around him. He wasn't looking at the budding plants or the repaired structure. His attention was fixed on the small, humble patch of earth where the Eldorian moon petals were just beginning to grow. He was crouched down, his large, calloused finger gently tracing the outline of a single fragile leaf. The wind howled outside, but in the lantern light the Iron Duke's face was unguarded, vulnerable. And on it she saw an expression she could not have imagined. In 1,000 years, a look of profound, heart-wrenching longing. He thought he was alone. He did not know he was being watched. And in that stolen, silent moment, Emma knew with a terrifying certainty that the books, the tea, the seeds, and the decade-old sketch were all connected, all pieces of a puzzle, whose solution was standing right in front of her, a ruthless Duke, secretly tending to the memory of a flower from a princess's garden. The vision of Caelan in the glass house haunted Emma. It was a secret she now held, a fragile piece of glass that could either cut her or show her the truth. She began to test the cracks she had perceived in his armor, no longer a passive observer, but an active participant in their silent, shared life. She started by leaving one of the Eldorian poetry books on a table in the library, a room he frequented late at night to review maps and dispatches. She left it open to a specific page, a poem about a lost love and a distant homeland. The next morning, the book was back in her chambers, but a small dark feather, the kind used for fletching arrows in Valerian, was marking a different page. The poem on that page was about a watcher in the shadows, a love undeclared, a silent vow. It was a conversation without words, a terrifying and exhilarating connection across a chasm of silence. Their strange unspoken dialogue continued. She would arrange a vase of hardy mountain wildflowers on the dinner table, and the next day a single perfect white rose, cultivated at great expense in the north, would appear on her breakfast tray. It was a courtship conducted by ghosts. The opportunity for a more direct confrontation came unexpectedly. As part of their ducal duties, they were required to undertake a tour of the northern territories to inspect the garrisons and iron mines. It was a political necessity, a show of unity and strength from the Duke and his new Duchess. For Emma, it meant days on horseback, trapped in close proximity to the man who was a living, breathing paradox. The journey was arduous. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, but relentlessly harsh. Emma, an accomplished rider, pushed herself to keep pace, refusing to show any weakness that might shame her or her kingdom. Kaelin remained as silent and remote as ever, riding at the head of their column beside Captain Garrick. But she felt his eyes on her. When her horse stumbled on a loose rock, his head would whip around his hand, instinctively moving towards his sword hilt, before he visibly restrained himself. When the wind grew especially bitter, a guardsman would ride up and offer her a heavier fur-lined cloak, saying only, "The Duke's orders." One afternoon they were riding along a high mountain pass. A narrow trail clung to the side of a cliff, with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet to the valley below. Emma, lost in thought, was riding slightly apart from the main group. Suddenly, a rock slide dislodged by the spring melt came crashing down from the cliffs above. It happened in an instant. A roar of cascading stone, panicked shouts from the guards. Her horse, a highly trained but terrified animal, reared violently, its eyes wide with fear. She lost her stirrups, her grip on the reins slipping. The horse shrieked and bolted, not forward along the path, but sideways towards the precipice. Time seemed to slow. She heard Isolde scream her name. She saw the sky, the jagged rocks, the terrifying emptiness of the drop. She was going to die. Then a black shape slammed into them. It was Kaelin, his warhorse, shouldering hers with brutal force, driving it away from the edge. In a movement so fast it blurred, he abandoned his own mount, leaping across the small space between them. His arm, hard as iron, wrapped around her waist, physically hauling her from her saddle and onto his. They landed heavily, his body shielding hers, as her panicked horse, now riderless, stumbled and fell over the cliff's edge, its scream swallowed by the abyss. They lay tangled on the narrow path, the dust and grit of the rock slide settling around them. Emma was gasping for air, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. She was crushed against Kaelin's hard form, his arm still locked around her like a vice. The smell of leather sweat and something uniquely him filled her senses. "Are you harmed?" His voice was a raw, guttural sound in her ear, rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. "No," she managed to whisper, her whole body trembling. He pushed himself up his movements, stiff. His face was pale beneath a layer of dust, his grey eyes blazing with a terrifying fire. He wasn't looking at her, but at the empty space where her horse had been. His hand, which rested on the ground beside her head, was shaking. The Iron Duke, the man who had crushed a goblet in his bare hand without flinching, was shaking. He surged to his feet and turned on the guards, his voice no longer a low rumble, but a thunderous roar that echoed across the valley. "Where were your eyes? You were to watch her, every moment." Captain Garrick, his face grim, stepped forward. "My apologies. Your Grace, it happened too quickly." "It is your duty to anticipate, to prevent." Kaelin raged, his control finally spectacularly shattering. "Her life is in your hands. If she had—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, his chest heaving. He paced the narrow ledge like a caged wolf, his fury so potent, so raw, it seemed to suck the very air from the mountains. It was not the calculated anger of a duke whose asset had been endangered. It was the primal, terrified rage of a man who had almost lost something irreplaceable. Finally, he stopped his back to her. He took several deep, shuddering breaths. When he turned back, the mask was partially back in place, but his eyes were still raw. He looked at Emma. Truly looked at her for the first time. The walls were down. In his gaze, she saw it all, the fear, the desperation, and beneath it all, the fierce, burning protectiveness that had been hiding in the shadows all along. "We make camp here," he said, his voice strained but firm. He walked over to her, and without a word reached down. But instead of simply helping her up, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her away from the cliff edge, his grip both powerful and possessive. He set her down gently by a sheltered rock, outcropping his hands, lingering on her arms for a second longer than necessary. "You are safe." He said the two words a vow, a promise that resonated far deeper than the simple statement. That night, as the camp settled, he approached her small fire. He didn't sit, but stood looming in the firelight. "The sketch," she said softly, the words escaping her before she could stop them. "In the shed. The girl with the dog. It was you, wasn't it?" He froze the firelight, catching the sharp planes of his face. He didn't deny it. The silence was his confession. "Why?" she whispered. "Why hide it? Why hide all of this?" He looked away towards the distant peaks silhouetted against the starry sky. "Because in my world, Princess—" He said, his voice low and laced with a pain that stunned her. "Things that are beautiful are the first to be broken. The only way to protect something precious is to pretend you do not value it at all." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her with a confession that was more devastating than any declaration of love. He didn't just see her as a political asset. He saw her as something precious, and he believed his love was a threat to her life. Kaelin's confession on the mountain pass changed everything and nothing. The silence between them returned, but it was now a different kind of silence. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken words, shimmering with a tension that was both terrifying and thrilling. He still kept his distance, but his watchfulness was now undisguised, a constant protective presence she felt at all times. Lord Morwen, ever the opportunist, noticed the shift. He saw the way the Duke's eyes followed Emma, the way Captain Garrick and his men now formed a near impenetrable circle around her whenever they were in public. Morwen's subtle, poisonous whispers to Emma ceased. He adopted a new strategy. He would no longer try to turn her against the Duke, but rather try to make her fear him. His attack was insidious. He orchestrated a discovery. A visiting dignitary, a man known to be in Morwen's pocket, requested access to the ducal archives for some historical research. A day later, he emerged feigning shock and horror, clutching a series of documents. They were official records from the night of the coup 6 years prior. Morwen, with a performance of grave reluctance, presented them to Emma in her private solar. "Duchess, I feel it is my duty to ensure you are aware of the full nature of the man you are married to, for your own safety." The documents were chillingly clinical. There were signed orders from Kaelin to his captains detailing the plan to seize the citadel. There were lists of nobles loyal to his uncle Lord Valerius who were to be arrested. And then there was the final damning report written by a scribe and countersigned by Kaelin himself. It described the final confrontation. Lord Valerius had not been in the throne room or his study. He had been found cowering in the royal nursery, surrounded by the toys of his young children. The report stated in stark, emotionless prose that he had pleaded for his life, offering his titles, his wealth, everything. The report concluded, subject Valerius offered no further resistance. By the order and the hand of Duke Kaelin, the traitor was dispatched. The nursery has been cleansed. Cleansed. The word felt obscene. Emma stared at the neat, precise script, her blood running cold. She pictured Caelan, the man who had gently touched a flower in her glass house, the man whose hands had trembled after saving her life, standing in a child's room and executing his own uncle. Morwen's earlier whispers about a brutal usurper now seemed like a gross understatement. This was the act of a monster. His own nephew and niece were in the adjoining room. Morwen added softly, his voice dripping with false sympathy. They say the children's governess had to cover their ears to block out the sounds. Caelan had them shipped to a remote monastery the very next day. They have not been seen since. The image was so horrific, so profoundly at odds with the secret, gentle man she thought she was beginning to uncover, that it shattered her. The man who protected beautiful things by pretending not to value them. Had he done this? That evening dinner was an agonizing torment. She could not look at Caelan without seeing blood on his hands. She could not hear his voice without imagining his uncle's pleas. The food tasted like ash in her mouth. When the meal was over, she did not retreat to her chambers. She followed him. He went, as he often did, to the high battlements overlooking the valley. The wind was cold, and he stood alone, a solitary figure, staring out into the darkness. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice, tight and shaking, startling him. He turned his face, unreadable in the moonlight. "Is what true? The archives, the nursery, your uncle." She saw his body tense, the stillness of a predator scenting danger. He did not ask how she knew. He simply held her gaze, his own eyes turning to chips of ice. "What of it? You killed him in his children's nursery." She choked out the words, tasting like bile. He was unarmed. He was begging for his life. He was a traitor who was selling his people to foreign powers for the price of his own comfort. Caelan stated his voice, flat and devoid of emotion. He would have seen Valerian enslaved and starved. I did what was necessary. Necessary? She cried, her control breaking. To butcher your own kin in a child's room. To orphan his children and banish them. What kind of man does that? For the first time since she'd met him, she saw a flicker of raw, deep pain in his eyes. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar iron mask. "The kind of man who rules Valerian," he said, his voice lethally soft. The coldness of his response was a physical blow. It was a confirmation of her worst fears. The poet, the artist, the silent protector, they were all a lie, a facade for the butcher beneath. The man who had saved her on the mountain pass was the same man who had murdered his own family. How could she reconcile the two? "I have seen you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. "In the glass house, with the books. I thought I was beginning to understand you, but I don't. I don't know you at all." He took a step towards her, his hand half raised, then he let it fall to his side. His face was a study in conflict, a war between some powerful hidden emotion and the brutal pragmatism he showed the world. "It is better that you don't," he said, his voice hoarse. "It is safer for you that you don't." He turned his back on her, then a final dismissive act that cut her more deeply than any sword. She had offered him a chance to explain, to deny, to show her the man she had glimpsed in the shadows. And he had refused. He had confirmed the story embraced the monster, and in doing so he had pushed her away, severing the fragile, unspoken thread that had begun to connect them. Emma fled her heart in pieces. She ran through the cold stone halls back to the safety of her chambers, convinced now more than ever that she was married not to a man, but to a monster. And Lord Morwen, watching from a shadowed archway down the hall, allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. He had not broken their alliance. He had broken their trust, and in a game of power that was even better. The days that followed were a cold war. Emma avoided Cailan with a new, desperate determination. She took her meals in her chamber, spent her days in the glass house, and spoke to no one but Isolde. The citadel, which had begun to feel like a potential home, once again became her prison. And Cailan, respecting the chasm she had placed between them, didn't pursue her. The light of their silent courtship was extinguished, leaving only a profound and chilling darkness. This was the moment Lord Morwen had been waiting for. With the Duke and Duchess estranged, the citadel's emotional defenses were down. He had spent weeks bribing guards, planting his own men amongst the servants, and mapping the castle's vulnerabilities. He didn't want to simply usurp Cailan. He wanted to destroy him, to take his title, his lands, and his bride, cementing his own power with the king by appearing to be the one who stabilized the rogue duchy. His strike came on the night of the first winter solstice festival. It was the one night of the year the stoic court of Valerian allowed itself a degree of celebration. A blizzard raged outside, cutting the citadel off from the world, providing the perfect cover. The great hall was filled with more warmth and life than Emma had ever seen it. A massive Yule log burned in the hearth, musicians played lively tunes, and the long tables were laden with food and mulled wine. Cailan sat at the head table, a thundercloud in the midst of the festivities, his eyes constantly scanning the room. Emma sat beside him, a frozen statue, the picture of a dutiful but distant duchess. The signal was a dropped goblet. Chaos erupted. Men who had been serving wine suddenly drew daggers from their tunics. Guards stationed at the doors turned on their comrades, Morwen's sigil hastily tied around their arms. It was a swift, brutal, and well-planned coup. Lord Morwen himself rose from his seat, a sword in his hand, his face alight with manic triumph. "Cailan, your reign of blood is over. The king will thank me for removing a tyrant from his seat." Cailan was on his feet in an instant, his own sword seeming to appear from nowhere. He did not shout or rage. His face was eerily calm, his grey eyes narrowed to slits. "Morwen, you fool, you have just signed your own death warrant." But Morwen had planned well. His men outnumbered Cailan's loyal household guard in the hall 3-1. Captain Garrick roared a command, forming a protective circle around the Duke, but they were being overwhelmed. In the confusion, 2 of Morwen's men lunged for Emma. Before she could even scream, Cailan moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature. He parried a blow meant for his back and spun his sword a silver arc that disarmed one of her attackers and buried itself in the chest of the other. He shoved Emma behind him, placing his body between her and the battle. "Garrick, get the Duchess to the armory bar." The door. Cailan bellowed his voice, cutting through the din. Garrick, his face a grim mask of blood and sweat, fought his way to her side. "This way, your grace." "No," Emma cried, grabbing Cailan's arm. "I will not leave you." Cailan turned to her, his eyes blazing with a desperate fire. For the first time, there were no walls, no masks. There was only raw, terrifying fear, not for himself, but for her. "Emma, you must go. I will find you." He pushed her towards Garrick. "That is an order." Garrick practically dragged her from the hall as the battle raged. But Morwen had anticipated this. The corridors were not safe. Traitors lay in wait in the shadows. They fought their way through passages, slick with blood. Garrick and his few loyal men falling one by one to protect her. Finally, it was only Emma Isolde and a wounded Garrick who managed to shove them into a small hidden chamber behind a tapestry. "Stay here," he grunted, barring the door from the outside. "The Duke will come. They heard him engage their pursuers, the clash of steel, a final choked cry, and then silence. Huddled in the dark, Emma and Isolde wept. All of Emma's fear and confusion had been burned away by the heat of battle, replaced by a single agonizing certainty she loved Kaelin, the ruthless duke, the silent artist, the brutal protector. She loved all of him, and she had thrown his love back in his face just when he needed it most. Hours seemed to pass. The sounds of fighting faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Then they heard footsteps approaching the door. A heavy, rhythmic scraping. The bar was being lifted. Emma grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her only weapon, and stood, ready, placing herself in front of Isolde. The door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted in the torchlight of the hall. He was covered in blood, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, a deep gash on his face. He leaned heavily on his sword, using it as a cane. It was Kaelin. He saw her, and the relief that washed over his brutal features was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Emma," he breathed. She ran to him, dropping the poker with a clatter, and threw her arms around him, not caring about the blood. He grunted in pain, but wrapped his good arm around her, holding her tightly. "Morwen," she whispered into his chest. "He is dealt with," Kaelin said, his voice ragged. "It's over." But it wasn't. From the shadows behind Kaelin, a figure emerged. Lord Valerius, Kaelin's uncle whom he had supposedly killed 6 years ago. He was older, scarred, but very much alive, and he held a loaded crossbow aimed directly at Kaelin's back. "Hello, nephew," he sneered, his voice a venomous rasp. "Did you miss me?" Kaelin froze, his body shielding Emma's. "Valerius." "Morwen was a useful idiot," Valerius spat. "He cleared the way for my return. You took everything from me, boy. Now I'll take everything from you, starting with your pretty little bride." Emma's mind raced, connecting the dots. The nursery, the children, cleansed. "You didn't kill him," she whispered to Kaelin. "Never!" Valerius cackled. "He didn't have the stomach for it. He locked me away in the deepest dungeon, telling the world I was dead to prevent a civil war. He spared me. A mistake you won't live to regret." He raised the crossbow. "The children," Emma said, suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "You didn't banish them. You saved them from him." Valerius's face contorted in a snarl. "My children were weak. He sent them away to keep them from my corrupting influence," he said. "He stole my legacy." In that moment, Emma understood everything. The ruthlessness was a lie, a shield Kaelin had created to protect his kingdom and his conscience. He had taken the blame for a murder he didn't commit to bring peace to his land. He had shouldered the reputation of a monster to save his family. As Valerius's finger tightened on the trigger, Kaelin moved. With a roar of pain and effort, he shoved Emma to the floor, twisting his body to take the crossbow bolt himself. It thudded into his shoulder, sending him staggering back. But as he fell, he flung the dagger from his belt with his good hand. The blade spun end over end, catching the torchlight, and buried itself in Valerius's throat. The former duke gurgled, dropping the crossbow as he clawed at his neck before collapsing to the floor, finally dead. Kaelin crumpled, his strength gone. Emma scrambled to his side, cradling his head in her lap. "Kaelin," she sobbed. Why didn't you tell me?" He looked up at her. His grey eyes clouded with pain, but clear with love. "You had to believe I was a monster," he gasped. "If anyone knew Valerius lived, if they knew his children were safe, my enemies would have used them to tear this kingdom apart. The world can hate me, as long as Valerian is safe." He had built his entire life on a foundation of necessary lies, sacrificing his own name, his own honor to protect everyone else, and she, in her ignorance, had condemned him for it. Tears streamed down her face as she bent and pressed her lips to his, a kiss of apology, of understanding, and of a love finally devastatingly forged in fire and truth. The aftermath of the serpent's strike was a landscape of blood and revelation. Citadel Vorlag, which had stood impassive for centuries, seemed to hold its breath, its stone halls bearing silent witness to the night's brutal truths. Kaelin, grievously wounded, but alive, was carried to his chambers, the same chambers Emma had once seen as part of her gilded cage. Now she refused to leave his side. For 3 days and nights, she was his nurse, his guardian, his anchor to the world. She dismissed the maesters when their pronouncements became too grim, and the servants when their whispers grew too fearful. With Isolde's help, she cleaned his wounds, forced broth and wine between his lips, and sat vigil through the long, fever-racked hours of the night. She would hold his hand, the same hand that had crushed a goblet, sketched her girlhood, and thrown a life-saving dagger, and she would talk to him, her voice, a low, constant murmur in the quiet room. She told him about her gardens at home, about her mother's moon-petal roses, and about the silly stray dog in the drawing. She told him how she had felt when she found the book of poetry, when she tasted the silverwood tea, when she saw him standing alone in the glass house. She confessed her fears, her anger, her terrible misunderstanding. She unburdened her own heart, laying it bare beside his wounded body, hoping that her words could be a balm to the spirit, just as the poultices were to the flesh. On the morning of the 4th day, his fever broke. She was dozing in a chair by his bed, her head resting on the mattress beside his arm, when she felt a faint pressure on her hand. Her eyes fluttered open. Kaelin was awake, his pale grey eyes clear and focused on her. "You're a terrible nurse," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "You fell asleep on your watch." A teary laugh escaped her. "You're a terrible patient. You kept trying to die." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Emma." He said her name, a prayer on his lips. The weight of years of secrets and solitude was in that single word. "I'm here," she whispered, her own tears beginning to fall. "I'm not going anywhere." Over the next week, as his strength slowly returned, the rest of the story came out. He told her everything, filling in the gaps of her understanding. He had been a young, unlanded squire in his father's retinue on a diplomatic visit to Eldoria a decade ago. He had been invisible, unimportant, but he had seen her. He saw her kindness, her quiet grace, the light in her that seemed so at odds with the stiff formality of court. He had sketched her from memory, a secret treasure he kept for years. That image of her became his guiding star. When he returned home to find Valerian rotting under his uncle's decadent and treacherous rule, the desire to protect his people became entwined with the memory of that graceful princess. He knew even then that a strong, stable Valerian would be Eldoria's best shield in a dangerous world. His ambition was not just for power, but for the power to protect. He confessed that he had faked his uncle's death and hidden him away, knowing that a clean, brutal break was the only way to stop the bleeding and prevent a protracted civil war that would have destroyed them all. He had sent his young cousins, Charlotte and Leo, to a secluded scholarly abbey in a neutral territory under the care of a trusted former tutor, where they could grow up far from the poison of their father. He received letters from them every month, a secret he had shared with no one but Captain Garrick. The reputation of a kinslaying tyrant was the price he paid for their safety and his kingdom's peace. When her father had proposed the marriage alliance, he said it felt like a miracle and a curse. He would finally have her, the woman he had admired from afar for a decade, but he could not show her his heart. To do so to reveal his weakness would be to invite disaster. His enemies, like Morwen, would have seen her as his vulnerability and targeted her relentlessly. His coldness, his distance, it had all been a desperate, clumsy attempt to shield her. "I tried to protect you from the world," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as he sat propped against the pillows, his arm in a sling. "I never imagined the greatest danger to you would be the lies I built to keep you safe." "Your lies are done, Kaelin," she said softly, taking his hand. "We will build a new truth, you and I." And they did. As Kaelin healed, they ruled together. Emma was no longer a silent observer at the high table. She was a voice of counsel, her knowledge of diplomacy, and her intuitive understanding of people, a perfect complement to Kaelin's strategic mind. She championed the building of schools and granaries with the same passion she had brought to her glass house. The court of Valerian began to change. The hard, stoic faces of the soldiers and nobles began to soften. Under the combined influence of their Iron Duke and their Rose Duchess, the citadel began to find a balance between strength and grace. Laughter, quiet at first, began to echo in the stone halls. Months later, on a warm summer evening, Kaelin took her to the glass house. It was thriving, a riot of color and life. In the center, under the moonlight, the Eldorian moon petals were in full bloom, their silvery white blossoms glowing with an ethereal light. Kaelin stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He was whole again, the scars on his face and shoulder, the only reminders of the battle they had won. "I always dreamed of seeing these again," he murmured into her hair, "but I never imagined I would see them with you." Emma leaned back against his strong chest, her heart full. She was not a sacrificial lamb, nor was she a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was the Duchess of Valerian, a woman who had been sent to marry a ruthless duke only to discover a secret king, a man who had ruled a kingdom of shadows in his own heart, waiting for a love he believed he could never have. Here in the moonlight, surrounded by the flowers of her home, she was finally truly home herself. And so the story of Princess Emma and the Iron Duke comes to a close. A journey that began with a cold political bargain, transformed into a breathtaking love forged in the fires of rebellion and tempered by the truth. She was sent to a monster, but found a man who had worn a monstrous mask to protect the innocent. He was a ruthless ruler who secretly harbored a decade-long love for a princess he felt he could never deserve. Their story reminds us that the fiercest armor can often hide the most vulnerable heart, and that true strength isn't just about wielding power, but about the sacrifices we make for what we treasure most. If this story of secret sacrifice and enduring love captured your imagination, please help our channel grow. Take a moment to like this video and share it with someone else who loves a grand historical romance. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next tale. And please leave a comment below. Who was your favorite character? What twist surprised you the most? Your engagement means the world to us. Thank you for listening.